Thanks for joining. I'm happy to see such a high interest in this topic. I've actually been asked to record this session. I'll try my best to actually do it and publish it at some point later on so that you can actually rewatch this. I will be going through this quite quickly because there's a lot of content to cover. So don't worry if you don't catch something very well. You will be able to rewatch a recording at some point later on. If you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and then I'll probably get to them at the end of the session. We can have some sort of a Q&A later on, right? Okay, so now the topic for today is the Power Automate desktop framework that I have created and published on GitHub. And well, obviously, I think you all know what's the purpose of the framework in general. You wouldn't be here, I guess, if you did not actually um, expect something great from this. The idea is generally that we have some standardized framework where we have standardized flows, and then we have, this basically makes it easier to read and understand them. It makes it easier to provide support and maintenance. It also makes it easier to document and then hand them over to actual clients, stakeholders, colleagues, and whatnot. But it also means that it contains reusable components, which significantly reduces the time for the initial development. Now, I've published it on GitHub, as mentioned. There's a repository called Power Automate Desktop Framework available on GitHub. You can if you know how to use Git and you have some experience, you can obviously just actually clone the repo locally to your own machine and get all of the source code in there, or you can just kind of download the whole thing as a zip file and then extract it. But the idea is that I've got this repository over here where I have separated each of the flows of the framework uh, in a separate folder here in a sort of a subdirectory, and then the source code inside of them. If we enter one of them, there's the source code inside the source folder, and there's a README file that explains how to actually start using it. And then there are quite a few of those flows, and there's a couple of folders over here called used for databases. So these are just these are not actual flows; they're just there for um, basically SQL Server or SQLite databases if you wanted to use that for storing external configurations or work queue items. If you wanted to go with that, there are options. Right, and then basically at this point we only have the source code in text files. But I will actually be publishing a solution file later on in the future, so you can actually just pick up the actual solution file and uh, import it into your environment so that you don't actually have to create every single flow from scratch. So that's something that's going to happen fairly soon. The reason I haven't done that yet is because, well, some of the functionalities in here were added by me to the framework due to the popular demand for things. So that's like, for example, reading an Excel configuration file. That's something that a lot of people use, Excel for configs. I personally never use that, and no one in my team ever uses Excel configs. So I've added this because people kind of, expressed the need for it, but I haven't used it myself. So I needed some time to test and, polish it and build it properly so that it actually works the way I would, expect it to work. And that's why the solution itself is not completely, finalized to be actually imported in here. But I've been improving and polishing the source code lately, and I think I'm pretty close to actually having it finished. Right. Uh, anyway, uh, as mentioned, there's a README file for the general thing. It basically has some general ideas that are needed. That you actually some recommendations for environments and solutions, and then every single flow in there has a README of its own that describes how to actually set it up. And when you would be creating this, what I recommend doing is basically that you actually set up an environment, as mentioned in here, a dedicated environment for the framework itself, and that should be the only environment where the framework should be created as an unmanaged solution. And then, because when that's where you would do any development and improvements, further changes to your framework if you wanted to make some changes. Because well, I would expect you wouldn't probably store everything I've got here. Most of that stuff is just there's too much basically for a normal enterprise. You wouldn't always use all of the configs available and so on. You would usually pick one and stick with that. So you might want to make some adjustments to my framework, redo some of the unnecessary functionalities and so on. So basically you'd have a development environment for the framework, and then you would export that as a managed solution everywhere else, including your normal development environments where you develop flows, and you share it with makers with run-only access. So they can only run those flows in all of those environments, basically allowing them to consume it but not modify it, so that the original framework itself in every other environment does not actually change in any way, and there are no unmanaged layers on top of it. But then uh, what this means is that normally people will be allowed to make copies of flows. So in general, that's where when they have the whole framework, the idea is that most of it is actually based on utility flows, and I'll show them in here, right? So you've got utility flows like browser launcher, config reader, email sender, and so on. And then there are a couple of them that are called flow templates. So there's a flow template, the normal one, the one I prefer, and then there's a flow template for work queues. So basically, this one actually uses the inbuilt Power Automate work queue functionality for storing work items, whereas this one actually uses SQL databases for work items. So, but basically, you pick one of these and you save that as a template that your makers would then copy. They'd make a copy of it, and then whenever they want to build a flow, they would use that as a sort of a template where they would add the custom code on top of the template. Whereas all of the others are just utility flows. They are only being called by flow template, and they're not being modified, and they shouldn't be copied either by the users. That's the basic idea. Right. So when you're setting this up, in addition to actually creating the environment and the solution for the framework, what you also need to actually decide on are a few things. So basically, first of all, on what to actually use for configs. I'll show you the config reader later on. I'll be actually building this so that you know how to actually build it from the GitHub solution. You also need to decide on where to log things. So there's a logger flow in here that also um, contains options for how to log. You can log to SharePoint, you can log to Dataverse tables, you can log to a plain text file, a CSV file, and so on. So kind of you need to decide on where you want to store those logs, and then you just basically provide the you can remove the unnecessary subflows from the logger functionality, so it only logs to one to the one source that you want to support, and you need to create the structure for that source. So that's why I'll get to that, but you basically kind of need to have a SharePoint list, for example, for log messages. If you decide to actually log it, I've got all of that defined in the README files for GitHub. So for example, the config reader has a description on how to uh, set up your configs. Right. So well, this describes how to create the actual flow, but then you need to create the storage, right? So you can either use a JSON config, which we actually have a sample of. Uh, where is that again? Yeah, that should be in assets. Right. So there's a sample JSON if you wanted to use a JSON config, or if you wanted to go with, for example, a database config, then there's a screenshot of what the table should look like with the column names and the data types. If you want to use a database for configs, then you would go to the database SQL Server um, directory for sample code. There's a code for setting up the database with all of the tables and stored procedures and so on. And if you want to use SharePoint for config, then you would go, well, you need to create a list which looks somewhat like this. If you want to use something else, like isn't using actually SharePoint for configs, but some different column names or whatever, then you'd actually need to modify the config flow, the config reader flow. But if you are okay with the structure that I'm recommending, then you actually just, you're able to just copy and consume the flow without needing to modify anything. Right. So Uh, I'll just quickly take you through the way you would go about creating the whole thing from scratch at the moment, while we don't really have a solution import. So you actually need to pick this up from the source code on GitHub. So first of all, you'd go to the cloud portal over here, and you will need to create a solution. I've already got one over here, but basically you just create a solution. I would recommend naming it PADFramework, but you can name it whatever you want. And when you have it over here, the important thing that needs to be created is well, a couple of them actually. So if you want to use work queues, then you have to create a work queue. Obviously, the work queues are actually created, well, I've added one over here, so just called a work item work queue. Uh, and then you also need to set up a few connection references that are actually required for this framework to work. These are the, required if you actually decide to use those functionalities. So for example, if you want to store a config in Dataverse or log your messages to a Dataverse table, then you need a Dataverse connection reference. If you're gonna send email messages via the Office 365 Outlook connector, then you need this connection reference as well. And then if you want to use SharePoint for logging or, well, config, then you need a SharePoint connection. These are the minimum requirements if you decide to use those functionalities, but they're optional. You can avoid all of those. So this framework is not really premium. You can actually use alternative methods, and then you don't need these connection references. Right, but that depends on your requirements basically. And then when you've got that, you would go about creating a new desktop flow for each of those that are already in here. So I'll just share a sample of how to create a config reader flow. Sorry about that. Right, so if I were to create one, let's call it Path Framework config reader demo. I've already got one called config reader, so I can create that one again. Right, and then as the README file on GitHub actually describes, there's just the steps that need to be performed to actually create this. So there are basically, yeah, create the actual flow, create input and output variables. Because this is a utility flow, it's supposed to be called by parent flow, so it has some inputs and then it pushes out some outputs. So there are several that need to be created, such as input config address, and there's everything described in here on what it has to be like. So data type is text, sensitive, true, optional, false, right? So config address is a thing, and there is a description for the descriptions for actually what to be expected are higher up over here with inputs expected. So yeah, it should contain the address for where the config is stored and then some options, right, for the different types. So you can actually provide this description so that users, makers, when they actually build their flow, they know what to provide as inputs. That's a good idea, obviously. But if you limit, for example, what config should be used in your enterprise, you don't really need to provide all of those options because you would usually just stick to a single type of config. Right, but I'll just quickly create these, right? So just where was that again? Input, config address, text, sensitive might be some sensitive values in there, not optional. Right, next up, right, that's not right. Clicked on the image. Input address, config path, again, text, sensitive, and not optional. Type. I won't explain every single one of these right now because the explanations are actually in the README file. And there's again lots of content to cover over here. Yeah, that one was not supposed to be sensitive, so I'll need to adjust that. Project name, and then a couple of output variables.
Hi, Agnes. A quick
Yep.
question. Is this session being recorded?
Yep, I'm trying to record it. It should be recorded, yes.
Okay, great. Because some people were asking. And we do have some questions also from the audience. Would you like to take it up now or a little later?
Um, we can try, yes, as I go through creating these variables.
Okay.
Can you
So,
raise the questions?
yes. So, the first question is, hey, Agnes, is the framework based on inbuilt work queue or Firebase or Excel?
Um, there are a few different options for work use. So there's one of the flow templates. Yeah, there's two flow templates over here. One of them is called flow template work queue. So this one uses the inbuilt work queues for Power Automate. And then the other one for the normal flow template with no suffixes at the end. This one is actually based on databases, so SQL databases. It uses the work item handler um, utility flow for all of the interactions with the actual queue. And the handler at this point supports SQLite or SQL Server databases only. So these are the currently supported queue types.
All right. The second question is, do you recommend creating work queue outside solution or within solution?
Um, well, where you create it is up to you, but you will need it added to the solution itself as a component. Otherwise, it won't be. Sorry about that. You won't be able to import it to other environments because there will be an unmanaged dependency thing, so it will fail on import. So it actually needs to be a component of the solution.
Thank you. And thanks to our questions, three more have come up. Do we have dispatcher and performer kind of template in this framework?
Um, Kind of. I'll show that when we actually build an actual flow. So there's the flow template is a thing where you have the most frequently required functionalities as already pre-created, and then when you basically make a copy of it, you create those subflows, and then you remove those you don't need. And it does contain subflows needed to actually generate work items, as in create work items and put them into the queue, and it also contains subflows for processing work items, so picking them up and running some sort of actions on them. So that's the for creating and for basically processing them. Dispatcher thing is something I would consider to be more appropriate for a cloud flow, but generally you can kind of build this into the framework, obviously in here as well, purely desktop flows. But some subflows might be missing from the template at this point. Might be, if you see something that you would think makes sense to be added, feel free to raise an issue on GitHub, and I'll see if I can add it, or whether it makes sense, and I'll add it to the templates.
Got it. Thanks. Does work have retry function?
Yep, I'll show that when we create the flows. Right. So
Okay.
just before the next question, so the next thing I'm doing is the next step after creating the input and output variables, create the new subflows, and we'll see notes. The notes in here say that, below over here, that in most organizations you would normally only have one type of external configs and not all of them. So you would usually skip the subflows you don't need and not create all of them. But if you absolutely want to just have the full framework, then just create all of these and then copy the text from the text files in source to each of those subflows. So I'll go with that right now, and you can raise further questions, and I'll just comment on if any of these are actually kind of worth commenting as I go.
Sure. Only a couple more. So the next question is there any customization for logging? Anything similar to add log fields in UiPath? This helps generating custom log fields for dashboard and reporting.
Not at the moment. Generally, it's just it's a standardized thing where you have the fields that you kind of that are defined in the logger flow utility flow. So you can modify the logger utility flow if you want to, but that would just mean that it's modified for everyone and not for the one user that's using it. So it doesn't really work that way with Power Automate Desktop, unfortunately.
Okay. And the final question, I think this is for everybody. After downloading the code from GitHub, can you please tell me how to open in my Power Automate? So maybe towards the end, you could give a short demo on this so that everybody can just learn.
Yeah, so I'm basically now showing that how to actually create this in Power Automate. You don't really open it in Power Automate Desktop, unfortunately. When I have published the solution file, you will be able to import it as a solution to Power Automate via the Cloud Portal if you have premium. So you can actually, if you're a premium user, you will be able to just download a zip file that can be imported via well, the import solution functionality in the Cloud Portal. But because I haven't done that yet at this point, you only have the source code, and the source code can only be copied and pasted, one subflow at a time. And that's what I'm currently showing actually, is how to create one of the flows. So, right, so I'm creating every subflow that's described in here, and then I'll be copying and pasting the actual source code. So I have the source over here, and I'll open one of the files. I copy the main one, the main subflow, paste it in here, and the actions get created. And then I continue to do the same thing with all of them. Might be some errors as I go, due to variables missing or something like that. But then when it's all complete, it will be fine.
Great. That was the last question, so we'll wait for the further questions. You can continue. Thank you, Agnes.
Cool, thanks. Right, so it's missing a connection reference at this point, so I need to fix that. Right. Okay. That's probably because I have removed the connection reference ID from the source code. So if you actually plan to use the Dataverse config, then you need to, you might have that error as you paste the code. Yeah, the JSON config is the easiest one. The SharePoint one will probably throw the same error. Yep. Just need to pick up the correct. Right, and then run Excel closer. And because this one is actually right, no, that's not the right one. This is probably actually a, yeah, okay, that's a bug, so I'll need to fix this. That's not the right code for this subflow. So fix.
Ooh, your code has bugs. That's the first.
Yeah, no, that's not the bug thing. It's just that I've pushed the wrong file to on top of this. Um, on top of this file over here, that's not the right code that should be in there. So I would need to actually, um, yeah, I'll just push the right one that's in my actual config reader flow. So I'll fix that later on after we complete this session. This is from a different flow. Right.
Got it.
Anyway, so once I would have pushed all of those subflows, I would just basically save this, and that's it. And you know, you would have a flow that's basically finished and created. If you know, when you're creating the flow template, you will also have these calls for actual utility flows. So for example, if I went on and picked up something from, that's what I wanted to demo with this actually, but unfortunately, not the wrong file over here. But if I went on and just pasted, for example, something that calls a different utility flow. So for example, this one over here, it will call the config reader, right? It should call the config. Oh no, that's a bad idea because that's the same flow. But yeah, the logger. Right. So I've got the logger over here. So I'd copy this, paste it in here. There will also be an error because I have removed the actual flow IDs and because they wouldn't match yours anyway. When you create your utility flow, it gets an ID automatically generated. So whatever is in my file will not actually match your IDs. And as such, you will actually need to target the correct utility flow. And so, for example, if I target logger, you might actually be, you know, told to fix the parameters over here. That's the main reason, well, one of the main reasons why I'm actually going to be publishing this solution, because this doesn't really work as smoothly as I wanted it to work when you just copy and paste it from the source code. So you actually need to do some manual work where I was hoping you wouldn't need a lot of it. There are like 5 or something like that calls for these utility flows in the flow template. So you would need to fix those when you create the template. It's not huge, but you might make a mistake when you target the variables, and that's what's annoying me. I was hoping that you would just need to kind of select the actual flow, and you would, the values that I've passed in would actually be retained, but they're not. That's a bit of a problem, a bit of an annoyance with Power Automate Desktop. So, when I've published the actual solution file, you will not actually need to go through the whole trouble of creating these whole, each subflow and pasting the code itself. So you'll be able to just basically get the solution imported, and that's it. Right. Okay, so that's a quick overview of how you actually create those flows, and then you would actually basically need to do this with all of them in the framework itself, basically going through each utility flow first. So browser closer, browser launcher, config reader, email sender, one of these, whichever you prefer. This one supports only Office 365 Outlook, whereas email sender normal supports the other options for Outlook app, email, SMTP, and so on. Excel closer, logger, screenshot maker, and then work item handler if you go with flow template that actually uses SQL work use. And once you've created all of the utility flows, then you can actually start creating the flow template, because it will require calls to those utility flows. So you kind of need to have the utility flows ready when you want to have a call for them in the flow template. Right, so you go with the flow template once you've actually created everything else. And then you decide on which one you want to use based on what types of work queues you plan on using. So if you just use the Power Automate work queues, you go with this one. It's a bit simpler. It has a bit less subflows because of the native functionality for processing work items. Or if you want to go with SQL Server, SQLite, or other sorts of database-based work use, then you build a normal flow template, and then you skip the other one that you don't really need. Right. So once you have created it, and then once you've created all of it, or well, once you've imported it into your environment after I've published a proper solution, and then you will maybe make some modifications to those flows. You might, as mentioned, remove some unnecessary subflows. You maybe want to add something else that I haven't thought about that is actually very standard in your enterprise, in your organization. You maybe use some specific functionalities very frequently, like launching a certain ERP application or something like that. You might want to build some extra utility flows and things like that. Once you do that, then you would export the solution. Basically, once you actually have it as a solution in here, you would want to export it from your dedicated environment for the framework. Yeah, well, I can't export it from this environment. Actually, I would need to export it from another one. Just give me a sec. So the one where I actually have it as unmanaged is over here. So just a sec. Right, so this is an unmanaged version of the same solution. So I'd export it, and then I export it as a managed solution so that everywhere else where I import it, it's managed, right? And it's whether or not you allow unmanaged customizations, but it's best to block them. But even if you don't, you will then share it with other users as run-only users, and then they will not be able to actually make modifications to your flow. They will only be able to run them or make copies of them. Now, what I have once you have done that, they can actually start making building flows using the framework, and that's what I'm going to show you in a minute. So basically, they would have this open, right? I'll just close this. I don't need this anymore. Won't save it. Right. They will see something like this, right? The PADFramework flows. They maybe less, maybe more if you add any further of them. And then, they would need to use one of the flow templates to build their flows, and they would basically, when they want to start it, they would need to make a copy of the flow because they shouldn't be able to modify it. Now, the problem with this, and that's a bug that I've already raised to Microsoft, is that some of these are for some reason not possible to make copies of, and that's exactly what affects the flow templates. Right, so I can't really make a copy because it's disabled. I have no idea why. I've raised this to Microsoft. They haven't replied yet. So the flow templates, they can't be copied for whatever reason if it's a managed solution. Some of the others can actually be copied. So I could make a copy of browser launcher, but I don't need that anyway. So the flow templates cannot be copied. If you experience the same, there's a workaround for this, and the workaround basically involves making the copy via the cloud portal. So you will actually need premium for this, but anyway, you would need premium for importing and exporting solutions between environments anyway. So this only is relevant for premium users anyway. So what you would do is uh, in your flows, it basically, yeah, click on the more details and then save as, right? So I'd make a copy of the flow template over here, and then it will appear in as one of my desktop flows. Right, so I'll create one called PADFramework demo. Uh, and I will actually be demonstrating the work queue, the inbuilt work queue functionality because of the simplicity of it. Right, so I'll create two copies actually as we demo this thing. Yeah, I don't think we actually have a lot of time for this, but hopefully this will go quickly. All right, so the generator flow is supposed to generate work items, as the name suggests. So I'll just build a very simple flow that I've actually used for demos of my error handling functionalities. That's supposed to. All right, so I'll make another one. That's just scraping the Lego.com page. So I'll show you what that's supposed to be doing. Right, so I've got SharePoint list with Lego sets that I would like to buy. And I've already owned some of them and some that I don't. And that's basically a thing that this is going to pick up these list items from this list, filtered by those that I don't own, create a work item in a work queue for me, and then the processor will actually go to lego.com, scrape the price for it, check if it has a discount, and send me an email if any of these sets are actually on sale. One of them is the Atari 2600 is actually on sale, so I should receive an email by the end of the flow if I, manage to actually demo the solution by the end of it. But that's the idea. Right. So what I'm gonna do now is I'll refresh this over here, and I should have those copies created. Right. So here they are, the processor and the generator, right? And I can edit them now because they're no longer part of a managed solution. They've been saved as my flows that are outside of the managed solution. So I can edit this one, and that's what I'm going to do. And to save the time, um, I actually have the code that's needed in some text files outside of the screen that you're seeing. So, but I'll just take you through what needs to be done uh, when you're actually creating a flow. So when you open this, there's a total of 28 subflows available over here, and some of them are unnecessary for some of your flows. Some are completely standard and don't need any modification, and some need some minor customizations. So I'll just take you through the whole step by step. Right? So and for the generator, I need to delete some. Well, in this specific case, I will just be deleting some of the subflows that I don't need. First of all, right? So, for example, I will not be needing close Excel because I don't use Excel in this flow. So I can just delete this. There will be some errors obviously coming up right away. I don't need execute Excel flow. It's used basically for launching Excel, reading, and so on. It also calls close Excel, and that's why it's now erroring out. Right? I'm gonna delete this. Um, the same way, I don't really need close browser because this flow will just call a SharePoint list and nothing else. Don't need close browser. I don't need prepare system because all it does is basically closes stuff that basically prepares the whole flow for running any systems that might be needed. So I don't need this subflow in here because it's all in the background this time. Right, then I don't need throw fatal error because fatal errors only occur when there's user interfaces involved. So this is not needed. Execute webflow should, because I'm not doing anything in web. Everything with web can actually be deleted for this case. Launch browser is also not needed. I'll leave some of these in the other flow so you'll see what that actually looks like. There's also a subflow called take screenshot, which is only needed when the user interface is involved. So again, not needed. And then there are a few with work items. So because these are basically all the subflows needed to interact with work items, and some of them are needed when you actually generate work items, like in this flow. So that's the generate work items, the serialize work item, and the insert work item. These three subflows are needed for the generator. The other four subflows are needed for the processor. So in a generator, we delete these four. In the processor flow, we delete these three and leave the first four. Right. I think this should be okay now. Right, and then I need to adjust some of those subflows, some of the remaining subflows. So first of all, I'll fix the few that have errors in them. So there's execute main flow. It's calling the prepare system, so I don't need that. And then it's also calling process work item. That's usually used for processor. And there's a config over here. There's a comment over here that says, call something else if you don't need the process. If this is a generator, and then call generate work items. So instead of process work items, I'll call generate work items. Okay. And then the cleanup on error thing is actually probably also not needed. Yeah, because it basically cleans up, so not needed in here. Okay, cool. And then there are a few more subflows that need to be modified. So main is completely standard and should not generally be modified when creating the flows. So I'll leave that as it is. Then there's the init, where we need to set some, unfortunately, set some hard-coded values because, well, in order to read a config file, we actually need to, or a file or a database or a table or a list or whatever, you actually need to tell the flow where to find that config, and this much at least needs to be hard-coded. So I'll do a bit of that in here. So there's a few things that have to be in here. All right, so I'm just setting a project name. These are used for logging mainly, and also for retrieving the configs for the specific project and for the specific flow. So You can really call these whatever you want. Obviously, this is just a demo project, so that's what I'm doing. But otherwise, it's yeah, you call it what makes sense. All right, and then the config type. In this case, I'm going to use a Dataverse config. I'll have a config table, and I'll need a config address and config path in this case. So I've got a table called config over here. It's a based on those on the structure that I've described in on the GitHub. And what I need to get here is a logical name. Right. The logical name goes here, but needs to be the plural name. And then the address. The address is basically the URL for the environment. So I would get that via the admin center. I'm not going to show you how to get that, but you would need to know how to actually get that. But that's basically the URL for the environment where the table is stored. If you're actually calling a Dataverse table. Otherwise, if it's a SharePoint list for configs, then you would need a site address, a connection string. If it's a database, whatever, so everything is described in comments over here, so you know what to actually call. All right, and I'll stick to logging to log files in this case, just for the sake of saving some time. That's the default, but you can actually switch to using CSV files, databases, or SharePoint lists and so on. Right. Then there's the config subflow should generally not be modified. This is it basically reads the config itself, calls the config reader, and gets some standard functionalities that should be there. Basically, it should be in the config. So, well, you only modify this if your configs don't really follow the standards. But if they do, at least this much should be in there. Some optional values that are that they're checked whether the object actually contains it or not, and only then they're initialized. But if your config doesn't actually need a URL object or something like that, you won't be adding it, and it won't error out because of it. But some are actually necessary, so um, you would kind of need to include those in your config, or if you don't include them, then you would need to modify the config subflow a bit. But in this case, I don't need to do that. There's a different one called get flow settings that's more specific, that's just specific for the particular flow. And then again, it has some predefined values that are frequently used that we just basically pull out of the config if they are there. But this is basically for a specific flow. So we inside the config object, we have a child object called flow object that's usually that contains some specific values for the specific flow if your solution project or whatever you call it contains more flows than just one. Right, and then I do have a few custom values in this one. Yeah, actually, I think I only have one. Let me check. So for the work item generator, I have a URL object, but that's already one of the standard values that's already gonna be picked up. And I have a list ID for the SharePoint list. I have that. I'll just pick that up like this, basically. Right, I just add anything that's custom that needed in here. Right. I've already modified execute main flow. That's the one that we did over here. So it calls to generate work items instead of process work items. And then inside generate work items for the generator, there are a few steps needed over here. So I'll be delete. This is just there. This is an empty table that's just there so that this doesn't error out the loop over there. Generally, we need to actually delete this, and then we need to create a custom subflow that will actually pick up the work items from wherever is your source. So whether reading a file or reading a SharePoint list, like in my case, or something like that. So I'll delete this, and I will create a custom subflow now for getting those work items. When creating custom subflows, there's a subflow called template, and that's the one you would use for adding anything that's custom. You basically just copy this, create a new subflow called get SharePoint items or whatever, paste this, and then inside the onBlock error, you put in every custom action you need, and that's it. Well, you also need to change this one action over here called add item to list to add the actual name of this custom subflow. So let's get SharePoint items. This is used for logging, basically. So this item will be picked up by the logger every time you call it inside this subflow, and then it will be removed from the list at the end of this subflow so that parent subflows do not actually use the same name. So that's just basically for adding the name of the subflows to all of your runtime log messages. But instead of typing it on every single log message, set variable action, you just add it to a list once. So basically, copy the template, change this, and then add all of your custom actions in here. Right, and I'll just copy and paste this from my source file. All right, let me just, cool. I didn't want to set this up manually, but basically it's just picking up the URL objects for the site address, the list ID. I think I have a filter over here, yeah, not owned by me, and that's using the correct connection reference. I've just got this. This is as much as I need. I then need to modify this a bit. Instead of the data table, I'm now using get items response, and that's it. So oh right, and I also obviously need to call the subflow. So, and just do the same logic if there's an error, like everywhere else. If there's an error message, exit. And that's it. Generate work items is now basically done. Then the next step is serializing the work item. So again, there's a comment on what needs to be done. So what needs to be set, basically. We need to set some values, add the actual values to the data source variable, uh, so that it's an object that's going to be pushed to the actual queue. So again, I've just for the sake of saving some time, I've got those already ready for me. So just gonna paste them. Some are just mandatory things like the number for the work item and the data source. That's just that's my structure. You could modify it, but that's what I recommend. And then the data content is an object that we kind of it's like a JSON blob that's being pushed to the work queue as a JSON object, and then the processor will pick it up and convert it to a custom object and then use that. So you add any values that you actually need to the JSON so that your structure for the work queue is basically standard. You only have the value field that contains everything you need, but then your custom flow actually gets the custom values from it. In this case, I only need the product number from the SharePoint list. Remember if I've closed it. So product
Uh,
number.
Agnes, quick question. Do we have more time for the session?
Yep, a bit. I hope so, unless you don't, but I will need to. Yeah, because
Okay. The idea was to ask at the end some more questions if the audience has. So
yeah,
let us know once you're completed.
yeah, okay. So basically, I'm done with this actually already. I've already serializing this. So basically what it will do is in the main flow, it will call get work generate work items. Generate work items will get will call the one custom subflow, and then run this where it serializes it, basically creates the object, and then it inserts them to the queue. So if I save this, and I can run this. Yep. And then I'll start on this one. So again, as the other one runs, I'll show you the work queue after it's done. But at this point, again, we start by deleting some irrelevant subflows. So I don't need Excel in this case, for example. I delete Excel. Um, and then I don't need the three subflows for generating work items. And yeah, I don't need logging into a web page. Yeah, that's not something I need for lego.com. And then I just need to fix the few that are actually calling it. So I've got prepare system that calls close Excel. So I just delete this, but leave the whole subflow because I have a browser. And then, right, so there's prepare web page. There's also editing out because I've deleted the login to web page subflow. It's only needed if you actually need to log in to some web page. Right. When that's done, I can actually start again with just those few modifications that are needed. So yep, the Dataverse config with the URL. Just give me a sec. And the table name. Right, so, and then this is done. I'm gonna go to execute main flow. Right, so I have a few customizations, and normally this usually could be enough. You just prepare the system to clean up before you start. You call process work items, and then you call prepare system afterwards, so that you clean up afterwards. But you can also add some customs over here as well. So I'll actually just add a few calls. I need a table that will be created over here. We'll show you why later on. And then I'll be calling a custom subflow called send info message. I'll show you that. That's basically sending me an email at the end of the flow when it's processed those, scrapes those Lego pages. Right. The next one that I need to modify is process work item. Process work items, though, is basically it's processing the queue. So it's picking up, it's getting a work item. If there's errors, it completes it, and basically there is a retry functionality over here. Basically, again, the error count thing is defined in the config, so we're basically looping up until as much as as we allow for retries, and then we process it. And if there's an error, we continue the loop. If there are no errors, we exit the loop. That's the way we do retries, basically. And we call process work item. And the process work items subflow does not actually need any modifications in general, the way it is right now, unless you want to change it. But the process work item is the one that is customized. Basically, you need to add the custom subflows in here for whatever you want to do in there. In my case, I only need to call execute webflow. Oh, sorry, that's not the one. My clipboard not working. There we go. And that's the one where I will actually be doing my custom parts. Right. The next thing I want to change is close browser, because the way it's set up by default is that it will close all browsers and all instances. So If you don't want that, you might need to provide some inputs in there. And I have an input browser. I have a variable for that. That's will only make it close the same browser that's being launched by launch browser. That's Edge, and there's a URL parameter. So initially, when it's running by prepare system, it won't have anything in the URL, so it would still close all instances of Edge. But if it when it actually runs, and if it needs to retry for some reason, it will only close it would try to attach to the URL that's been opened. Right, and then I'm gonna start by creating the custom subflows next. Right, and then when I'm done with them, I'll add the calls for them in the appropriate subflows. Right. So again, I'm just gonna open template because I'm gonna need multiple copies of it. Create one called navigate to product page. Right. This is again just scraping lego.com. So navigating to the product page, that's basically URL. Just copy and paste the code. So I've got the base URL in config. I'll replace it with the product number in the URL. Yeah, the product number from the work item. I should actually have that product number. So that's probably, what is that set? Oh, right. I forgot to add this to. There we go. So I'm picking that up from the work item data content. That's just the object that's been generated by the generator flow and now picked up by the processor flow. And then I'm using the product number in the URL. That's the way to navigate to a Lego page for a specific product. Right, and then I've got a few that's just called get product name. For example, this is just gonna scrape the name of the product. These are just sample subflows. You would do whatever you want for your project, but the idea here is that I'm a sample case for my own personal flow. Right, so I'm getting the page title and parsing it to get the product name so that I have a nice table at the end of the of the flow for the products that are on discount. Get product price. And arguably this would take, maybe slightly longer if you're just creating this from scratch. Obviously, I have the code ready for me, but I'm just showing you how easy it is to generally create the same structure. You just copy the template for every single subflow that you create, and then you only add the steps that are custom. Yep. Okay, my clipboard is slower than I am. Right, so again, I'm just getting some prices. I'll be converting them. Yeah, again, just basically converting the price of the string to a number so that I can actually make some calculations. So, making some calculations on the discount. Okay, missing something. Oh, right. So yeah, that's going to be fixed later on. So just calculating the discount, and if the discount is larger than zero, then there is a discount, and that basically means that I'll add this as just a HTML content to a list variable that I'll be sending out to myself afterwards at the end using the send info message subflow. That's the one that I'm missing now. All right. And I'll just set some variables over here. And I've actually copied and pasted this. This is a utility flow call run this for the email sender. I've just copied and pasted this from a different subflow called send error messages. It's in there. So over here, just basically copied this and pasted it into the other one, and then just set the variable values to whatever I want to send. Instead of sending the error messages that have been logged throughout the flow, I send the table with the discounted products, and I set a different recipient and so on. But otherwise, this action is actually already there. And you would, again, as the comment over here describes, if you don't want to use the Office 365 connector, you would call the different utility flow. You would modify this one. The send error messages is a standardized subflow, but you would change the child flow that you call based on which mailbox you want. Right, and these are done, and then the last step is to actually just add the calls to all of these subflows to execute webflow. So again, I have a retry functionality in here that will just retry as many times, as you set for the web retry kind of a thing. But it's already retrying on work items themselves, so you don't necessarily need this. And if you don't want to, retry too many times, you could actually either reduce the numbers or just, remove this loop entirely, and you would just then get a retry functionality on the work item, process work items subflow instead of the execute web flow. But this also, kind of contains a retry functionality if you need that. And it has a standard call for preparing web page. It also has a standard call for taking a screenshot if there is an error. And basically, it will loop, and then you need to put in any of the custom subflow calls in here. And that's the last step to this. I'm going to just add all of them. Again, do this, in order to save some time. I've just copied and pasted this from a source code file that I've already got in the background. But, generally, these are just basically copying this, pasting it, and changing the subflow that you want to call to the one that you need. And if there's an error, then loop to the next one. There's a custom rule over here for one of them where I don't want to retry. If this error's out, I assume there's no sale if the sale price fails. But that's beside the point. That's the part of error handling. So basically, if you need some custom rules, you change the way it behaves if error message is not empty. And that's it. And now I've got this one ready, the other one completed. I can show you what the work queue looks like. It should have some items in it. Right, so it has some items queued for the products, and I could run the other one, just gonna save it. And as it runs, I can answer the question. Right. All right, this is just the outputs that were returned. Right, so I'll run the processor, and now for the questions. Yeah, I know this was a very, fast-paced demo. That's because there's lots of content. It's hard to fit this into an hour. But again, it's getting recorded, so hopefully you can rewatch this if you didn't catch something. All right. So as it runs, should actually be seeing it as it scrapes the Lego.com page, but it should close the Edge browser and should should work on it as it scrapes. Now, where was the last question that I've already answered? Which one do
Uh,
I?
so there is one question. Is it possible to sort the subflow within the dropdown or to change the sequence? At the moment, you really have to be careful how you create them with regard to the sequence.
Yeah, well, the sequence, the way I've built this, it doesn't really matter, honestly, um, for subflows within the template itself. Uh, you know, Obviously, you can't really sort them afterwards by name. They will just show up in the order that you've created them in, which is not very fun. But otherwise, I don't really think that's important because there's a search functionality for it, so you can easily search for the subflow you're looking for. So I mean, no, you cannot sort them, but I don't see this as being a huge problem.
Thank you.
Um, I can see a I can see a comment on go-to activities. Yeah, so the reason I use go-to activities is because I'm gonna actually comment on this. Is because if I used exit subflow, I would need to do lots and lots of code repetition, and I don't like that. Um, so for example, in this is probably uh, not a great example. Let's think of where I've got some of those exits. Okay, well, assuming that I have more subflow calls in process work item, for example, if I didn't just execute a webflow but have more steps in there, I would essentially need to do all of these. Yeah, okay, I'll get kicked in. Just give me a sec. All of these on every case, including the exit subflow. So I would need to log the message and remove the subflow name. I don't like that idea. So I only use a single label called exit, and I only use this. Then that's the only label I use. I don't like using go-tos either, but that's the best way I found to actually exit a subflow in a clean way without having lots and lots of code repetition. And well, the rule is basically to not have any more labels in it. Only this one, only the one for exiting in a clean way. And that's it. Right, so it's scraping the pages and well, kind of working nicely. So as described, um, if you do some setting up initially, you need to think of where you want to um, store your configs and prep that in advance. So in my case, in this case, this was a Dataverse table. You could also just store it in a JSON file or whatever, or a SharePoint list. There's samples of that provided in the GitHub repo. Uh, and then you need to decide on whether you want to log things. So I'm logging in locally on a log file. So I've got this, and yeah, this one's being prepped, I think. Yeah, so the work item processor is running right now. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. It's actually a JSON file in my case. So it's just logging stuff. All right, so it's failing to get the sale price because that product is not on sale, but that's expected. But otherwise, it's actually running and it's working fine. But you can also log in a SharePoint list and database tables. I think that's what's supported at the moment. We if we might add some further logging functionalities. Well, there is CSV files as well that's supported. If there's a demand for any other types of logging, that could also be added in the future. Right. So once you decide on those, you just need to kind of provide some parameters to the init subflow for where to get those configs from and where to log to. And once that's done, just basically kind of decide on whether your flow is supposed to generate work items or process work items. So you delete some of the unnecessary flows and then add the custom flows and add appropriate calls to those custom subflows. And that's it. And basically, you can, well, this flow normally, if I was not just copying and pasting stuff from an existing source code file, and I was just actually building this from scratch with the actual, scraping capturing the elements on the web page and all sorts of stuff like that. It would take me, maybe an hour to build something like this, both the generator and the processor. Saved something like 25 or 30 minutes by actually copying existing code, but also, slowed down a bit by explaining things to you. Right. Any further questions?
Not at the moment. One is there. Uh, how do we manage connections and connection references when importing it into another environment? I was forced to create connections manually in the higher environment before I import the solution for the first time. Any recommendations?
Yes, you will need to create those connections in there. That's a thing that needs to happen. A connection needs to be there for a connection reference to be able to target it. So you can either create it before you started the import, or there's an option to create them during the import. So there's a menu, or the user interface actually allows that. If there are, you can select it from existing connections, or if you don't like those that are already there, you need a different one. Or if there are none, you're actually allowed to create them. But you need to create them anyway, and it needs to be done manually at this point. I don't think there's a programmatic way to actually create connections in the cloud portal at the moment. But then when they're there,
Follow up question on that. And the connection name has to be same in all the environment.
no, it doesn't. You will have the option to select when you import it. You will be able to select the connections. If they're named the same, they will be selected automatically for you. If they're not, and it doesn't, and if the UI itself doesn't actually kind of understand which one to pick, they will just tell you that these need to be reviewed and you should pick which one you actually want to map your connection reference to. But they don't need to be named the same. They usually are not.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Right, so I can also see a question about the framework. So the framework is the framework itself at this point is only available as source code files on the GitHub repo. I'll share the link. Right.
I think at the end you'll be sharing all the links and the recording links as well, right?
Yeah, so the repo is here. I will also be pushing a solution file so that you can import it instead of creating all of those flows from text files. So I'll be pushing that to GitHub later on. I'll just answer some questions I can see in the chat. So there's the using shared connection references between different users. Yeah, that's possible. Well, at least it should be possible in the near future. There's talks about embedding embedding connection references to a specific flow as you share it. So that I don't remember if that's already generally available or only in preview, but that's a thing that needs to be published, enabled by Microsoft. So If it's not there yet, it should be there in the near future. Uh, and then the one, uh, yeah, there's no functionality in the template for handling credentials right now. So you would need to come up with some way yourselves. Basically, the recommended way by Microsoft is storing them in Azure Key Vault, picking them up with a Cloudflow, and then pushing them to the desktop flow via a sensitive input variable. So that's the way that would be recommended. But there's also a way that if you use CyberArk, this for Power Automate Desktop has a native integration with CyberArk, so that's also an option. If you use something else, then you kind of need to build your own functionality for picking up the credential. I think we'll wrap this up, and if you have any further questions, we can actually take this over to the appropriate channel after the session.
All right. So thank you, Agnes, for a wonderful session. I think we all enjoyed it. Very descriptive and very detailed. And I think you have addressed most of the queries. And hopefully, if people have other queries, they can follow up with you. But a fantastic session. Thank you so much. And we look forward to having more such sessions from you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for joining, and I hope you liked it. And if you have any feedback on the framework as you try it, feel free to message me or post it on the GitHub repo, and I'll address it. So yeah, thanks.